Kyle McNulty, and you're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. With me in this episode is Oz Wasserman. Oz is co-founder and CEO of Opsin, which provides access control capabilities to LLM outputs, ensuring users only get appropriate outputs based on their access level. The company was founded earlier this year, but they've already seen strong customer and investor interest given they're aimed at a key roadblock in making Gen AI more available within the enterprise. Before Opsin, Oz worked in product management at high-profile technology and security companies for most of the last decade, including Fireeye, Abnormal, and Ricoh. In the episode, we discuss everything from the origin story to the technical challenges of applying access control to these outputs and how to maintain current records despite a constantly changing access landscape. This episode is brought to you by VulnCheck. VulnCheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. VulnCheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about VulnCheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. VulnCheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. VulnCheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of VulnCheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With VulnCheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about VulnCheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Oz, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kyle, for having me. How's it going?
It's going well. I'm excited to hear a little bit more about everything you've been working on. Certainly a very relevant space right now. But let's think about your background for a minute here, because you've been working in product management for most of the last decade across some pretty high profile, both broader technology, but mostly security companies, including Fireeye and Abnormal. So, take me through just some of that kind of early product experience, and what were some of the lessons that you learned in terms of building a cybersecurity product that reaches your appropriate target audience and has the features that your users are ultimately looking for?
Great. So maybe I'll take a step back before I answer your question. So my career started in security, pretty much in the Israeli Defense Forces, where I did a lot of security engineering and really dove into the world of cyber pretty early on. I was about 18, and that taught me a lot about, obviously, the space and how to look into different technologies, especially on the offensive front. But then I moved to the United States and, like you mentioned, started a few of these product management positions. One of them was at Fireeye, and another one was at Abnormal and Ricoh AI. I think most of them obviously were on the vendor side, building security products from various ranges, all the way from email security to SaaS security to data security and adjacent areas. And I think to your question, my mantra through all of these really good experiences is to really focus. Most of the companies I've been lately, like Abnormal and Ricoh, what I admire the most about it is just to focus, because you're small, your team is small, it's strong, but it's small, and you're trying to take on competition from a lot of these behemoths and bigger organizations. So the focus is the most important thing, and the focus is what is the core problem that you can solve for customers that now they have an immediate need to be solved, and how you can do it 10x better. So that's kind of like a high level approach here. But what does it really mean? It means that you have to stay very focused on who has this problem. What is the ideal customer profile that has this problem? Focus on what are their actual challenges on the day-to-day. Do they have a workflow? Do they have a process? How does their problem looking like? And then you're trying to create this ultimate flow that basically solves it to the best extent that they can. And once they see your product is much more superior than others in solving their problems, it kind of creates this ripple effect I've seen really well at Abnormal, that people just come and love the product because it truly solves the problem in the right way. So I would say the focus is the most important thing. You can't do everything. You just need to focus on one lane. And then once you do that, dive even deeper and be very quantitative about who's the ideal customer profile. What is the proper persona here? What are their challenges and how do you solve it better?
What one feature are you particularly proud of in terms of kind of bringing it into one of these products over the last handful of years?
Good question. So I think the latest one I worked in before we started Opsin was a lot about the identity threat detection and response that I did for the SaaS security vendor I work with called Rico. Basically, the reason I'm so proud of because we saw there that identity is just the new parameter, and there was so many events that are happening in SaaS. People just didn't know about it. And, from data exfiltration all the way to some account takeover attempts, all the way to even the smallest misconfiguration and post-related things. And it's all about behavior that happens in the actual product. So what we did there, we were able to create this policy engine that was able to assess who the identity is, what the role of the identity is really up to, and a little bit more context around what have they done? Have they communicated with the organization? Have they done any type of action on specific SaaS applications in the past? And then correlate that with all the contextual information from the SaaS itself to really bring the best detection and response that you can for SaaS-related events. The reason I'm proud of it is because there's a big gap in that market where basically a lot of the products out there were focused more on posture and focused more on configurations as opposed to actual behavioral analysis and actions that people take in these tools that were actually pretty significant in some of the occurrences we saw. And we're able to do it in such a scale. There's millions of events happening in SaaS at every organization, especially the enterprises that we served. And we're able to design this engine in a way that detected and responded to events and alerts within seconds and triggered some automation in the background. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and that's an example where you kind of had this idea of how you take it to the next level from a kind of correlation standpoint and just overall analytics and rules engine. But what about thinking on the other side where you had this idea and other folks around you didn't necessarily agree with it? So I'm thinking about the kind of role shift from product manager to CEO, where now you call the shots in your kind of first and last call at the end there. What's an example where you had an idea for one of these products and the team didn't get behind it for whatever reason?
So I think that is actually the funny story about my time at Fireeye, right? At the time, things like business email compromise and attacks that started not just by a URL or an attachment that is happening in an email, but just shifted towards being more just plain text from someone's like, hey, are you in a conference now? I'm your CEO. I need you to do this and that. So like a lot of it became more of a social engineering based attacks. And we were there at Fireeye. They pioneered a lot of the handling on URLs and attachments, basically malware detection and these core cybersecurity capabilities that were literally the attack vector for years and years. But then, around 2017, but until today, the attack patterns have shifted, especially now with generative AI. It's more about a payload-less attack and less about, scanning URLs and attachments. And I think when I was at Fireeye, we recognized that basically from the market, but the culture of the organization was so focused, and the DNA of the organization was so focused on malware detection and malware analysis, it was really hard to move people out of their way to think differently. And we were trying to address this, but I think from a culture and technology perspective, the company believed that, the attack vector is still around malware and is still around these analysis where, in hindsight, as you can see today with companies like Abnormal, it is truly shifting to be social-based attacks. And I think for me, it was a hard struggle because on the one hand, we, as product managers, we knew, based on the market signals, based on customer advisory boards, that the attack vector and the way that the attacks are playing out is shifting. I think from a cultural perspective and from the DNA of the company, that was hard to move it around. And that's why also product manager is not about just developing with engineers. It's also about convincing, and it's also about bringing forward a lot of what you're thinking and get the alignment internally for people to move forward with your approach.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And as you're talking through this, I'm thinking about it's probably not just a culture issue where people at Fireeye are dead set on malware, but also I imagine there's some element of kind of information gathering where, because the team has been so focused on malware, they continue to see all the different indicators that show, malware is continuing to be prevalent, whereas folks in the broader industry that might not have that same level of insight and that same depth in the kind of malware space then don't see that signal with the same amount of strength. And so you have this kind of disconnect and just this different lens where you're almost disadvantaged by having that additional depth and something that's starting to age out a little bit further.
That's correct. So I think, you could always, as product folks and people that are leading these initiatives in the organization, you can always take a small sample size and have this cognitive bias on the fact that, this is probably representing the market. But I think nobody's perfect, including myself. You have to really assess it continuously. You have to do discovery continuously, whether with your customer base. At Fireeye, we had an amazing customer base, thousands of customers that you can just tap into and go on a call and ask what is the most intense challenge that you have now in email security. But it's applicable for any type of industry and any type of product, right? You have to stay with your hand on the pulse, especially on the market is just evolving pretty rapidly. And again, with generative AI now becoming such more rooted in a lot of these things, I think we will see much faster shifts around attack patterns. And I think product teams, especially on the vendor side, need to be being mindful around it for sure.
So let's talk more about the kind of AI shift and how that ties back into Opsin. You'd been working at Rico, you had some of this experience on the identity side, and you actually reconnected with your teammate from Abnormal to go ahead and start the company. So you kind of had this identity experience and you grabbed someone from your previous company and go ahead and put this together. I mean, what did that inception story actually look like?
Yeah, so during my time in Rico, we did some internal work with large language models and seeing really the effect of this amazing technology on our small startup. And I remember going to an event that Plug and Play organized here at Sunnyvale, and a lot of the generative AI folks came and gave a talk and talking about, how complete industries that now can leverage a lot of the GPT-4 are actually unblocked from doing things that they couldn't do with automation, couldn't do with artificial intelligence. And I remember that I went back home and it was just, it hit me so hard. It was like, wow, we're in an era that is as big as the internet change that happened in the early 2000s. So I remember at the same time, I was like, I want to be part of it. I want to see how I can bring my experience and my expertise to help organizations do that. And the first and foremost thing, but very high level at the time, I was like, I can take my security background and help these organizations just enable that technology to just be adopted, rapidly, quickly, as much rooted in the organization as possible. But I'm not, I know it takes a long time, and it's not just the technology, it's about stakeholder management, it's about pushing it forward with the different departments in the proper way. So I reached out to my buddy, his name is James. He was leading the ML platform team at Abnormal Security when I was there. A pretty extensive background in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we just reconnected, and I told him the story, and we started to work together, and we basically talked to over 300 professionals, whether they're from security teams and enterprises or whether they're AI leaders, and kind of got a lot more around the problem space, around more about the challenges and the state of the market, which kind of drives us to put our thesis down and starting developing Opsin.
I've talked on the show a decent bit about the importance of those early conversations and the design partnerships that actually enables. But as you throw out the number 300, it just kind of occurred to me, what percentage of those conversations do you think were actually successful? Because I would imagine it's a fairly small number, but at the end of the day, that sample that is successful ends up being incredibly important towards the success of the company longer term. But I'm just curious, in the context of that 300, how many do you think were actually like really useful and really helpful in kind of guiding the direction of the company?
And that's an excellent question. So I'll break down what successful means in this state. So for us, right, coming into this market, as you know, the generative AI boom with OpenAI kind of accelerated really quickly in the last 2 years. But as we talk to organizations, we realize that over 80 to 85% of them are actually just experimenting. They're actually just starting the journey. So before you talk to the market, before you really internalize that from customers, you can't really guess that. I was even pretty naive to think that people are just deploying it in production and having great use cases and realizing value very quickly. But going through this exercise, I think, is crucial for founding teams to go through, kind of realizing that this is not the case. So I think from a success perspective, I think all of them were very important for two main reasons. One is to really understand the state of the market, which really ties into our thesis that everybody's experimenting. And the second thing we discovered, not with all 300, but I would say about more than 50 to 60 of these early initial calls said the same thing. Said that they're pretty blocked from the moment of just experimenting and not really sure what the return on investment from these generative AI projects will be. And even things like manual committees that the security, legal, and compliance teams just sit and push back very strongly against these projects. That kind of created, this chicken and egg problem. On the one hand, some stakeholders in the organization just want to push it, want to show that generative AI is the next technology that can boost the organization in operational efficiency and effectiveness and creating net new business. But on the other hand, there is the traditional stakeholders in the organization that, naturally will push back because of risk, naturally push back about the skepticism. So to your original question, I think there's two main things that these initial discussions really helped us with. One is the market, the market sentiment and where it is. And the second thing is more generalizing on the problem and the challenge. And obviously, as we went along beyond what I'm just saying, is just narrowing down what will be the right persona and what will be the right, what will be the right people to drive these initial product efforts, especially deploying Gen AI, that helping us shape the product moving forward.
And as you had those conversations and kind of understanding what some of these different roadblocks were and why they weren't able to roll it out more effectively or comprehensively across the organization, one of the things you obviously stumbled across was the importance of access control for the outputs of these models, which has kind of led you to where you are with Opsin today. But tell me a little bit more about just what that kind of looks like and your approach for trying to address the access control challenge.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we realized fairly quickly is that organizations, they want to achieve things with generative AI, but a lot of it falls down on two main things. One is, how do I get the return on investment from this project? I'm going to deploy it. I'm going to experiment with it. I have a specific business case that I'm trying to achieve. Is it going to be working or not? So that's the situation where you are in experimentation mode. You want to go as fast as possible to realize value. So that's like number one. And the number two, like you mentioned around the access, is a lot of these security and compliance and legal teams were showing a lot more worrisome about, okay, like this is a black box system for us still. It's really much like if you develop a Gen AI tool internally, most of the time sits in the engineering or AI lead, again, depending on the maturity of the organization. And those development teams are not as close to the security teams when it comes to generative AI, especially when the experimentation is happening. And then there's this dissonance about what they know, how the generative AI works and what they don't in the security team. But one of the most fundamental things we heard from everybody is the fact that different people need to do different things with generative AI models. For example, financial analysts that want to integrate a financial co-pilot into the organization, they have certain tasks that they have to do with their financial data, with their customers, or with their area of expertise. But they not necessarily need to see all the budget for the entire organization or some of the board approvals on the financial side. So how do you actually making sure that the right people have the right access to data when you know in order to realize value, what I said before, you need to connect a lot of the organizational data to create context for these generative AI systems. So that was kind of like a leading headwind, if you will. So organizations were like, well, if we're going to do this, how do we put the restrictions on access and controlling the data into it? The way we see it at Opsin, there's two layers to this. One is the access control, which is, all right, Kyle, you're a financial analyst. I'm going to give you access to the model itself, and you can query the model to begin with. If you cannot get access, you cannot query anything, meaning that the risk goes significantly lower, but your ability to realize value is not existent. But the moment you get the access is the moment specifically with generative AI. If you connected organizational data, there is no restrictions on these. So anything you achieved with data governance and security out of the model, outside of the area of the model, is actually somewhat disappearing in the generative AI stack. So how do you ensure that these access control and permissioning on the data are enforced at query time? So our approach is more about developing these security and governance abilities from the very get-go, so organizations can stay secured. And the second thing is, if you want to ingest data to generative AI in a secured manner, you got to do it from the very start, so organizations can connect any type of data that they want. And the reason for it is that you can achieve the business value faster if you have a lot more context to your organization.
So thinking a little bit deeper into that access control realm, right? You mentioned, hey, we want to make sure that the financial analyst that has access to the broader model only has access to query the information that's specifically relevant to them. So let's say the region that analyst specifically covers on the finance team. Thinking about enforcing that, you mentioned specifically at query time, what's the approach to doing that? Because certainly in this problem makes a ton of sense, but in practice, the actual implementation of it is significantly more difficult. What's the approach you've taken to try to address that?
Yeah, so it's definitely not the easiest thing to do because, there's two approaches here. One is you're trying to control access and permissioning through, blocking people from just going into the model itself, or having some manual policies, somewhat of an AI firewall. I'm sure you heard that term. In order to really control who can see what can be retrieved and what can not be retrieved from the model. I think the challenge with these approaches are that are not scalable. I mean, obviously, we're now at the early stage, but when generative AI will be in production with hundreds, if not thousands of users using it, we're going to introduce the same headache or nightmare that security teams had with different products in the security space when they had to manage a lot of these policies themselves, and it became a full-time job of a security team to kind of do that. So I think the approach that we took is to take it from the very get-go, is to be able to look at the data that you want to ingest to the model, whether if it's documents from tools like OneDrive and G Drive, or it's even a structured database such as Postgres and MySQL, and even CRMs that some of our partners are using, like Salesforce and NetSuite. But each of these have a different way of the data to be structured, and a different way that permissioning is being done there. So the way that we look at it is this. We understand who you are. Kyle is a product manager or an engineer. So this is his role. And we are correlating the permission from each of these data sources into the model. So for example, if Oz outside the model is able to access any type of marketing files in my organization, the same thing has to be respected in the model itself. So we're using IAM systems, and then we're using things like the permissioning on files, the permissioning on databases, and permissioning on CRMs to really create this permission-aware models where the security teams can just have out-of-the-box access and permissioning on the data, and on top of it can put whatever policies they want. And that's valuable because of two things. One is you literally get security from the get-go, reducing a lot of the risk around exfiltration of sensitive data or unauthorized access to sensitive data, because I'm kind of understanding who you are and what you need to get access to. And it doesn't matter if you're an internal employee of the company, if it's a co-pilot or an assistant, or if it's a chatbot that is the customer has to use. I still have to validate who you are as part of the model. And then what do you have access outside the model? So I respect that, and I orchestrate it into the generative AI model. So that's in high level what we're doing here at Opsin, is really allowing you to start securely, removing all these burdens from managing policies, removing all these burdens from, creating any type of connections, and then really orchestrating connecting data, connecting any type of foundational models that you want in a secured way. Because the mission is to help you run fast, help you run these experiments successfully so you can get more budget securely and then run with it to production and stop being blocked at the first square.
So thinking about these different access control elements, it makes a ton of sense surface level that you want to kind of pull in the permissions from these various systems and ensure that they're maintained in addition to the data that these models are actually being trained on in some of these different systems. So use the example of CRM. In practice, I imagine that's much more difficult. You have access that's constantly changing within an organization, whether you have a new user that's onboarded, a member of the team that's no longer using a permission, so it needs to be changed, or someone requests a new permission. So that makes it much more difficult if you're actually training the model based on these different access inputs. On the flip side, if you're trying to control based on the outputs, then you have to do some sort of live check against these underlying tools, which is going to make the response much slower. And in that case, you also have to perform some sort of conversion between the output of the model and whether or not it leverages a specific permission within the application in order to grab that information. So my point in saying this is the idea sounds perfect conceptually, but I imagine it's very difficult in practice. What has your approach been to address that?
Yeah, that's a very accurate statement you said. So I think, in theory, that's very the right thing to do per se. Like is basically to maintain the permissions and having people get only the access that they need. I think in practice that the reason we call ourselves an orchestration layer is this is what we're building. We're building the ability to orchestrate the same level of permissions and control you have on data that is ingested to the model, and be able to know confidently that the moment these permissions change on the original file, you need to respect that in the model. The moment that you have a new role that is a new user under a new role that is already associated in the Gen AI model, you need to respect that in the model as well. So it's kind of this layer that helps orchestrate the secured connection of data and identities into the generative AI model. And a lot of the work that we're doing is to literally assess a lot of these original tooling, whether if it's CRMs and data and structured data sources, and understanding main things is like, one is what is the permissioning mechanism that these tools have, and the second thing, what did you ingest into the model so we can have the same permissioning structure that you had outside the model respected in. And the reason that we're doing it is exactly like you said. The flip side of it is to manually try to control it or not control it at all, right? You can't do anything in between, because if you do it in a manual fashion, then you'll have to, whether the security team or the AI team, again, depends on who's going to be responsible for securing the data and the intellectual property of the company in these generative AI tools, but they will have to go understand if there's a new user, what are they going to do with this new user, what type of permissioning he or she needs to get. And then also on a new data source, how do you know, that there's a new data source connected to the model or the developers need it, and then that means there is new type of permissioning. So manually doing it will be like back and forth between security and the AI teams. Will be like, hey, we need this user in, we need that user in. And from my experience, these things don't scale. So our thesis says that in order to really realize generative AI value, you really need to widen the adoption and not restrict it, because that's another approach, right? You restrict only for a couple of folks in your organization to use this generative AI model, but then you don't do it justice because maybe 2 people in your team is using it, and then they see the benefit, they see the value. Why don't you roll it to the entire organization? And you see massive operational improvements, and you just do it securely. So I think from a technology perspective, a lot of our efforts is on this orchestration layer, is orchestrating the secured connection of data to the models. And on the flip side, there is obviously, as we mentioned, a lot of these operations to restrict permissioning and access to models from the traditional security world. It's nothing that is reinvented, but it's a new stack, new technology that you have to respect the same things in order to enable the organization to use it securely. So that's our mission. That's what we're trying to do.
So what about from a product standpoint, what this actually looks like? Because you're talking about, hey, we have these models that we're helping companies go ahead and implement, and they have to ingest data from all these various sources and make sure that they're doing it in a secure fashion. You have this kind of custom orchestration layer that's built over it. This sounds very specific to an individual customer deployment, where there's a lot of kind of hands-on tailoring that needs to be done for that customer, as opposed to just rolling out a SaaS app and saying, hey, enter search query here. So what does that actually look like? How do you think about that from a scaling manner as well?
Yeah, so typically we're starting. Give you an example of a project that we're doing, but it starts with experimentation. It doesn't matter if they use Opsin or not, but it starts with experimentation. So we help the team. Again, we're orchestration there. We want to orchestrate any type of connection, any type of data, any type of foundational model for you, so you can achieve our goal is to make you go out of experimentation to a wider adoption of the tool. So for a big food delivery service that we work with, their project was around financial copilot. They want to streamline a lot of the financial data from structured data sources such as SQL databases, and then some Snowflake, and there was a CRM in NetSuite, and a bunch of documents from OneDrive, and the ability to really take that generative AI model and put it in the hands of the financial analyst to streamline the reporting services. So the way we did it technically is like we have a subset of financial analysts that are looking into the data, and what we did is we at the beginning, it's not just about just ingesting the entire Snowflake instance. It's about really testing out and seeing how the model will perform with specific financial information that is about 1 to 2% of the entire financial data that the organization has, and making sure we see the value fairly quickly on what is defined. So for us, technically, again, it's the ability to help them with the data connectors. So connecting NetSuite, connecting OneDrive, connecting their SQL database, and connecting the Snowflake instance that they have, and then streamlining the data in a way that we create this, what we call a metadata index. So layer on top of the vector database or the vector search that they want to execute if it's just a database. But the ability is to really have that metadata layer that says what anytime you're trying to query, anytime the financial analysts are trying to query, they'll hit that index layer when they try to retrieve data. And this index layer will understand if that person has the access or not. And the way that we actually identify who that person is by connecting to it to Okta or to Entra ID to really understand, all right, this is Oz, he's from the financial department, this is the role. And while I have the role and I have the data that is trying to be requested, the way that we implement it is a policy engine that allows you to understand, first and foremost, inheriting a lot of these permissions from the original sources. So, for example, if my role as a product is meeting a role at Snowflake that can see specific tables or specific rows, I'm going to respect that in the model itself. And that allows me to build these out-of-the-box policies into the model in order for the customer to really get those financial analysts somewhat seeing only the universe of data that they're able to see, and orchestrate that as we go. And from a scaling perspective, again, it depends a lot on how much information these generative AI tools will be fed. As of now, we see with most of our customers it's capping at 10%, but there's definitely a world where this is widely adopted. There is going to be a lot more data feeding into it. And I think our technical challenge is to streamline exactly what I told you in a much larger scale of data. But to be honest with you, I'm excited for that time to happen because, again, our mission is to really get them out of experimentation, which is what happens most of the time is just across the board at this stage.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the other factors that could influence the ease of some of those integration pieces as well, right? Like as compute speed gets faster, then maybe you're able to train these models like almost on demand or on a daily basis. So then you're able to kind of sync permissions from end of day, the prior day, and then you have a different requirement from an orchestration layer and what you're pulling from Okta real time when a query is actually made at the orchestration layer. So certainly lots of interesting potential ramifications of all this experimentation and just progress in this space more generally. But I mean, with that in mind, you're obviously fairly early on. You just founded the company earlier this year, but you've already landed this project with the food delivery service that you just described. how do you think about what's kind of top priority for the company in terms of getting in front of more organizations and getting to experiment with their different data sets versus just building out the fidelity of the platform as well in this orchestration layer and improving accuracy, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so we're now partnering initially with a handful of design partners and customers from different use cases. This food delivery is one of them, but we have actually a lot of technology companies that deploy different type of use cases, from chatbots to AI assistants to co-pilots. And then we basically see that a lot of, again, going back to the original comment I had in the beginning, there's just so many organizations that want to use it, have the budgets, and they're stuck at square one. What am I doing? Am I going to see value from this? So our approach here is basically make these initial customers successful, create the success stories with them, and really quantify the value that the organization wants to achieve from generative AI in a secured manner, and just help them, again, as simple as that, just help them get out of experimentation, widen the adoption, and see the value of generative AI. And I think as a company, our goal is to really make these people successful, because I do believe that not in the far future, but semi in the 5 to 10 months from now, more and more organizations will be ready with their technical maturity, with understanding a little more about their peers' use cases with generative AI, how it worked. So creating these success stories is also educating the market about what is achievable with generative AI if you do it in a secure manner, and how risk cannot just be a blocker, but security can enable you to run faster. And this is our goal. We want to enable you to run faster. So I think that the focus of the company right now is to make these initial customers that we have in design partners successful, and making sure that we build the success stories and the use cases strong enough, not only with the security team and the AI teams, but also with the entire business, so we can take it to adjacent industries and educate them and teach them what can we do with generative AI, so we can help them partner when the time comes, and again, move them into more of a Gen AI transformation journey, like we're doing with the first initial design and customers and design partners and customers.
Right. Okay, quick hit last question for you. Are you currently looking for investment or hiring?
So we closed our initial investment round this year. So for now, we're not fundraising at the moment, but we are hiring, especially on the engineering front. So we are looking into founding engineer and a staff level engineer. So please reach out if you see fit, and then contact me for any more additional information on it.
Perfect. Well, really appreciate the time. A super relevant space right now, and a lot of just turmoil, let's say, in terms of how organizations are actually using these LLMs internally, and certainly access is one of the kind of key roadblocks for getting over the hump and enabling more rollout of these tools internally. So thank you.
Definitely. Thanks for having me, Kyle.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.